Lauren? Very good. Off we go. So we'll begin with our meditation.
Okay.
Oh, don't show this again. Like that?
Sure.
Okay. Yes, so we'll begin with our meditation. So let's begin by checking in with our dashboard. Spend a few moments checking in with ourselves. So first off, what is the current risk that I'll experience? That I experience a state of crisis? Is it low? Is it moderate? Is it high, very high, or extreme? Am I in the window of tolerance? Hopefully, yes. Maybe perhaps you're a little outside or very outside. 3, where is my energy tank right now? Full, 3/4, half, or near empty? And have you been tracking your targets using the whole Starry card? And if you are, how would you rate your targets right now? And finally, how well am I focused on what I am doing? I can't read the full title of the IFS mindfulness practice because of the little toolbar. Let's just begin. So let's begin by finding a comfortable position with your feet on the floor or your body supported by the chair. If it feels okay, gently allow your eyes to close or soften your gaze. Take a slow breath in through the nose and an easy breath out through the mouth. No need to change your breathing, just notice it. Noticing the body being breathed. Allow yourself to arrive here, exactly as you are. Now gently shift your attention inside, not to fix anything, not to calm anything, just to notice. You might become aware of sensations in the body, maybe some tightness, maybe ease, restlessness, warmth, numbness. Whatever is here is okay. And you might also notice thoughts, images, memories, emotions, or a general sense of mood. In this work, we call these experiences parts, not parts in a broken sense, but parts as aspects of being human. There is no need to name them yet. Just notice something is here. If it feels safe enough, see if one experience gently stands out right now. It could be a feeling in the body, a worried thought, an urge to analyze, a sense of fatigue, or even a part that says, I don't like this. Whatever arises, see if you can turn towards it with curiosity. You might silently say, I notice you, or I'm aware of you being here. You're not trying to change it. You're not trying to understand it fully. You're simply allowing it to be seen. Notice how you're relating to this part. Is there openness, impatience, judgment, or distance? Whatever your response is, That too is just another part, and that's okay. Now see if you can sense the place from which you are noticing. There is something in you that can observe thoughts, feelings, and sensations without being any one of them. In IFS, we call this self, the natural capacity for awareness, calm, curiosity, and compassion. You don't have to force this, just notice. I am the one who is noticing. And from this place, see if you can offer the part you noticed a bit of kindness, like you might offer to a child or a friend. Nothing dramatic, just a gentle presence. As we come to the end of this practice, remember, you didn't do this wrong. Whatever showed up or didn't was exactly right for today. Over the coming weeks, we'll get to know these inner parts more deeply, with respect and care, at a pace that feels safe. For now, take one more slow breath in and out. And when you're ready, gently open your eyes, bringing this quality of curiosity with you. Here we are, the schedule. We're week 23. It's April 1st, so happy April Fool's Day to everyone. I forgot about that. So there's a little message here for the in-person participants only. On April 8th and 22nd, the Kiwanis Festival will be using the front of the church where we usually meet. So we'll be meeting in the parlor, which is the room we used in the past few years. So for some of you who were here participating in the course last year, know it's a small room down the back hallway. It's best that you enter from the back parking lot through those doors. And if you're coming from the back parking lot, the room will be up the hallway and on the left. And we'll have a little sign there for everybody. And that's April 8th and 22nd. So we won't be in this front space. Here's our practice schedule. Next week, which is April 8th, there's a practice preparation, which is happening today, and then that'll be presented next week, correct? And that's with Anna P. And then there's a few messages.
So the homework from last week, of course, if you have any questions or comments, please submit to itsimple2023@gmail.com. You were to read Simple Manual Session 27, continue to use all your tools and crisis plans and chain analysis, etc. And continue tracking all the skills you've learned using your skills list. Homework for the coming week. So continue to submit those questions to the email there. Continue to use your tools, crisis plans, chain analysis, etc. Continue tracking all the skills you've learned using your skills list and practice them. Make sure you have sessions 24 to 29, the PowerPoint or PDF slides. They were emailed out. Certainly, if you did not get them, please email in and we'll make sure we get those to you. You'll need these to do the IFS work over the next few weeks. And like I said, it's part 1, page 1 to 63 of the workbook will be the homework for next week. I'll give you a minute just to write that down. Okay, good. The homework habits checklist, certainly I won't go through that, but if you need to review, please go back and look at the slides. The reminder for the participant agreements. So keep comments, questions, and feedback relatively brief, just a little reminder there. So like a one breath of sharing. Weekly announcements. Just a heads up as well, for the Boyne group on Monday, it will be Easter Monday, but the Stratford Family Health Team building will be open. So I believe it's a go. We have a couple people that will plan to participate, so. Can't read also the first one here, so, I'm gonna leave that blank. We think it's a very important session, the intimate relationship repair, session that's towards the end. It addresses difficulties in intimate relationships and how to approach them. It brings together DBT's interpersonal effectiveness skills with what you'll learn in IFS. It also reviews the major couples therapy approaches. It covers a lot of material. So extraordinarily, that session will be extended until 1 p.m. You're welcome to leave at 12 if you've had enough. We've also added a pilot informal session, intimate bonding and sexuality, that we're going to workshop on June the 10th. If we get positive feedback on it, we'll formally add it to next year's schedule. So can you read that? No, I don't know. Oh, there we go. Starting next week, the homework will be to work through the IFS workbook. Last week, we emailed everyone the PowerPoint PDF slides for sessions 24 to 29. You can use those to do the homework. It's about 800 slides. These slides are also now available on the website, itssimple2021.com. You'll go under the news tab on the left-hand side to access those slides. As with other parts of the course, you'll get more out of IFS if you actually do the work. For the in-person participants, only on April 8th and 22nd, so hard to believe April 8th is next week, the Kiwanis Festival will be using the front of the church, this area here. So once, like Joan said, we'll meet in the parlor room. It's kind of across from Weight Watchers for those people that are coming from the back of the church. Emailed questions, comments, and feedback. We had tons of good questions and comments this past week. The first question, whose answer we will read out loud today. Last week, you compared the Simple group to a fancy restaurant and most of the rest of psychiatry and psychiatrists to going to McDonald's. That comparison activated me. I really like my psychiatrist. Don't you think your comparison was a bit presumptuous? That's a really fair comment, and we appreciate you calling that out. When we use that comparison, we weren't trying to suggest that this group is better than the rest of psychiatry or that other approaches are somehow inferior. That would be too simplistic and honestly not accurate. What we were trying to point out to is something more specific. In this course, we put a lot of time into choosing and preparing the material, trying to integrate different models, making them accessible and offering something that's thoughtful and cohesive. In that sense, we don't think the content of the course is high quality and carefully prepared. But that's where the fancy restaurant metaphor breaks down and where your point is absolutely right. The course runs into problems in the delivery. We don't have the resources for individualized attention, pacing things to each person, or walking alongside each of the participants in a sustained way. So in that sense, the course is not a fine dining experience at all. Had we been more careful with how we framed things last week, we might have refined our restaurant metaphor. We do take great care with how we prepare the food, but for the format or service is more like a buffet. You take what fits for you at your own pace, and some things may land more than others. We should have emphasized how different settings serve different purposes. What happens in individual therapy, standard psychiatric care, or other programs can offer forms of support and depth that this course simply can't, and vice versa. We are grateful for your perspective and accurate comment. It's a helpful correction and a good reminder for us to stay grounded. We'll now briefly summarize the answers to 2 questions that were submitted, but we also provide a fuller answer, which we invite you to review on your own time on the website. When I went over the slides for week 22 that you posted on the website, I noticed a section on high conflict people. I think you said that because of technical glitch, we didn't discuss that idea that last week. And that's what Joan kind of hinted towards. I thought it was an interesting idea and that it might be good to bring it to other people's attention. So the core idea is some people repeatedly create conflict, not just because of situations, but due to enduring patterns of thinking, emotion, and behavior. 4 key patterns is blaming others, externalizes responsibility. 2, all or nothing thinking. It's like the rigid black and white views. 3, intense unmanaged emotions. 4, extreme behaviors, escalation, impulsivity, aggression, and withdrawal. This is driven by underlying insecurity, maybe threat sensitivity, personality patterns. conflict becoming a maladaptive coping strategy, like a poor coping strategy. Common types of HCP: blamers, distrusters, avoiders, volatile and reactive patterns. The key insight: you can't reason your way out of conflict with HCP, so high conflict people. Focus on managing interaction, not changing their personality. The practical approach: don't take it personally, set clear boundaries, use brief, calm, structured responses, emphasize choices and consequences. And the takeaway is high conflict is a pattern in some people, not an event. Manage the pattern, not the argument. Much more on session 30, where we take an IFS lens to interactions with high conflict people. So you can read this on your own. Certainly go back to the slides, the website, this is on there. And I'll leave this as well for you. I know Joan and I, when we did this 2 weeks ago, we we're like, oh, that's a really good topic. Because a lot of times when we're doing ours, teaching for our skills, everyone's like, but how do you deal with that really difficult person? So certainly go back to these slides, please. Some more. And how to protect yourself emotionally from high conflict people. This is also a slide. If that is a question that really interests you, please go back and review. Last week you mentioned that DBT's Wise Mind, IFS capital S Self, and Daniel P. Brown's Ideal Parent Figure were related concepts. Can you elaborate? So these three concepts, Wise Mind, Self, and the Ideal Parent Figure, are really different ways of pointing to the same underlying capacity: a regulated, compassionate, non-reactive state from which healing can occur. DBT frames this state as a skill we can access in the moment. IFS sees it as an innate core self that can heal our parts. The Ideal Parent Figure provides that same healing through an internalized experience of secure attachment. They're not identical, but they're deeply related. Three different maps pointing to the same territory: the place in us or available to us, where we are calm enough, safe enough, and connected enough for real healing to happen. So this also you can read on your own: Wise Mind, capital S Self, and the Ideal Parent Figure. So you'll notice the little yellow dots as well. If you're kind of like, what slide was that? You can certainly go back and review on the website. Maybe I'll let you jump in.
Yes. So for the following questions, we will only read the question, not the answer, and invite you guys to go back if you're interested in hearing the response on the slides. So one question was, what is the difference between small s self and capital S self? So there is the response there. So again, as Nicole said, it has the little yellowy gold dot in the upper left-hand corner. Those are the slides that we encourage you to go back and review. Another question was, what is spiritual bypass? And there is the answer there. And this question, I understand that healing from trauma and pathological grief happens when people's nervous systems go from being stuck in polyvagal theories, dorsal vagal collapse, to through connection to others, nature, meaningful work, etc., moving towards ventral vagal activation. Does this also explain the healing that happens in IFS? Very good question. And again, here is the response to that. So please, we encourage you to go back and read over. So the takeaway here: trauma isolates parts of us in states of shutdown. Healing occurs when those parts reconnect through the compassionate presence of self, allowing the nervous system to move from dorsal vagal collapse back to the ventral vagal connection. And here is a 2-minute exercise to help you notice your part. You want us to go through this? Okay. So before we start talking about IFS today, let's try a very brief exercise. Take a moment and think about a recent situation where part of you wanted to do something and another part of you resisted. This could be something small. For example, Part of you wanted to eat something unhealthy, and another part wanted to stick to your diet. Part of you wanted to go to bed early, and another part wanted to stay up watching something. Or maybe part of you wanted to say something to someone, and the other part held back. Just take a few seconds and let one example come to mind. Now, ask yourself two simple questions. First, what did each part want? One part might have wanted comfort, leisure, escape, rest, approval, or connection. While another part might have wanted discipline, safety, control, or responsibility. Second, which part won? Did the part that wanted the action win? Or did the part that resisted it win? Just notice that inner conversation. What IFS suggests is that this kind of experience, part of me wants this and part of me wants something else, is not unusual or pathological. It is simply how the human mind works. In IFS, we take these everyday experiences seriously and begin to understand different parts of ourselves that are involved and how, in their own way, they are trying to help us. There we go. All right.
All right. So Joan was talking about how this is a bit of a buffet. So today it's a really large buffet. I think I have like close to 200 slides. I do put that yellow dot at the top. So there's a lot of slides that we're going to skip over. I'm just going to go over the essentials. But as in a buffet, don't try to eat everything that's out there. You know, just pick a few things that you like. The slides are always in the websites. You can always go back if you're interested in something, but we can't cover all this material. So today it will be, we started a bit of an overview of IFS. We talked about why we're going to go into IFS as opposed to other trauma processing approaches. And we started talking about parts and stuff. It was interesting. This Monday we had a Boeing group, and you know what strikes me is that sort of been kind of thinking about IFS for a few years now, and when you play with ideas like that, now parts are still real to me. They truly are real. They become real. What I realized is that for a lot of people, and this came out in the Boeing group on Monday, it's like, what do you mean we have parts? So it's a foreign idea for a lot of people. And we just kind of assume because we kind of we're marinated in it, right? We just assume that, oh, everybody kind of understands, or this has become, you know, a real concept for most people. And I realized Monday that for most people, it's a bit of a foreign concept, right? And we're going to talk a little bit later about, because I was thinking, when I was thinking about this, how things become very real, like parts become very real. There's a social anthropologist whose name is Tanya Luhrmann. She's like my favorite anthropologist. So I have like favorite anthropologist, favorite philosopher, favorite, you know, all favorite type of people, psychiatrist. But Tanya Luhrmann has written a number of books, but one of the books, her first book was about psychiatry. It was super interesting. It was, she enrolled, I think it was at Yale, so she had no medical background, but she enrolled in their psychiatry residency, not to get a degree as a psychiatrist, but just to be an observer, to be an anthropologist. And so her first book was an anthropological study of psychiatric training, which is fascinating, right? But one of her latest books It's called How God Becomes Real. And it kind of relates to parts, right? Because she says she immersed herself in an evangelical church and accompanied people that had just began to attend the church and, you know, weren't believers necessarily. But what she says is that when, and this was sort of the bottom line in her book, is that when you think of concepts or like God, for example, right? And you begin to converse and you begin to imagine it. The more you do that with time, it becomes more and more real. And difference is that beginning, it's not something real, but you know, by the time people have attended and you know had conversations and you know made God their friend, which is something in evangelical churches people do, and becomes a very personal. It becomes something very, very real, right? And so I was thinking a lot about that, and this is there's in Buddhism. This goes back to Buddhism. There's this concept called the Topa, and Topa is exactly this. It's how you know, beginning maybe somewhat imaginary figures through our interacting with them become more and more real until they're quite real, right? And I think this is like process with IFS is at first, you know, parts and self, it may, what are you talking about? They may not be real, but once you, you know, marinate in it, the hope is that these parts really become real, because when they become real, it's a very powerful form of healing for you. Okay, both that the capital S self becomes real and your parts become real, and then they interact with each other. So yeah, so let's dive into continuing our overview of internal family systems. You know, we covered a few things last time. So this week, that was week 22. Week 23, we're going to continue talking about what is IFS. I'm going to talk about how it integrates, because we covered a lot of different models like attachment and trauma and structural dissociation and stuff like that. How does it integrate those models? We're going to talk about how to find parts, just beginning talking about that, right? We're going to spend in weeks 24 to 29, where we go through the workbook, right? So don't worry if you don't get it today. We're going to come back to it. Weeks 24, 29 really will give you a lot of practice trying to find your parts. And we're going to talk about trailheads are, and we're going to end by going to give you a little bit of a roadmap for weeks 24 to 29. So what are we going to do? How are you going to do it? Going to give you an overview of that. So that's kind of the plan for today. And this is something I encourage you to go back. So I kind of put there in more detail exactly what we're going to do each week from weeks 24 to 29. So go back to that. And this is just a little bit more of a breakdown for what we're going to cover today. So we're going to talk about 4 types of parts. We're going to talk about burdens. We're going to talk about, oh, that should be capital S self. I put it small s, but it should be a capital S self. We're going to talk about interactions between different parts, how healing is conceived in IFS, what happens, how do you unburden parts, which is part of healing. You know, this is something Stu mentioned last time, which is therapist parts. I don't know if we're going to have time to cover that, but therapists definitely have parts. I'm going to talk about how do you foster or access your capital S self. So how do you know, make that more real for yourself so it begins to have more healing power. We're going to talk about identifying parts. Sure, we're not, so this is like the buffet. We're not going to cover all of this. Yeah, and then we're going to finish with what you need to know for sessions 24 to 29. So a little bit of an overview. Okay, so let's pick up where we've left off last week. And what I mentioned last week, I didn't go more deeply into each of the parts, but I mentioned that there's 4 parts. Like IFS says there's really 3 parts. I think there's 4 parts. I'll tell you why. So the first is the exiles. We briefly talked about that. Those are the parts that carry most of our pain, and a lot of them are parts from childhood, but they can be adult parts as well. And then, because those carry their pain, they're exiled, and they're exiled by protectors. And there's two types of protectors. There's managers and firefighters. So they're both types of protectors. We're going to go a little bit more in depth into it. And the fourth part, which is, this is not, so in IFS, they don't consider this a part. I kind of, because it's so different, I think it's a bit of a part. But IFS, they call it the rational manager. So the IFS says it's a manager, but it's different from all the other managers because most of the other managers are really emotional. And rational managers, like, you mature adult. It's like rational mind. It's the part that we try to, like in DBT, it's rational mind, right? So that we'll talk a little bit about that. So quick recap of what we talked about last week. So we introduced a basic IFS map. Wounded parts called exiles carry the pain of past experiences, so trauma and attachment issues. And then there's protective parts that are called managers and firefighters. They work hard in different ways to keep that pain out of our awareness, so we don't feel that pain, right? What we experience as symptoms, we're going to come back to this. So if you have anxiety, if you have depression, if you have dissociation, right, those are actually in IFS, those symptoms are actually symptoms belonging to a part. And those symptoms we'll talk about later can be a trailhead. So they can be ways of beginning to find your parts, beginning to try to identify and understand your parts. Okay, so what we also said, because we covered this, exiles are young, vulnerable parts carrying trauma, pain, and unmet needs. They're often pushed out of awareness to protect the system from their pain, right? You don't want to be feeling that pain, but you often do because, they do kind of surface. When exiles are activated, you feel intense emotions, you have flashbacks, you might have nightmares, you might have a lot of different symptoms. And exiles can also drive repetition of old patterns, right? Because we've talked a lot about in this course how people tend to repeat same, sometimes not dysfunctional patterns that aren't really what you want to do, but you find yourself repeating old patterns, right? So that's all a function of parts, right? Then, and this is all a recap from last week, we talked about protectors, and there's two types of protectors, managers and firefighters. Their jobs to keep the exiles from overwhelming us with their pain. Managers are proactive. They're the everyday protectors. So they control, plan, avoid, please, and criticize. Right? Firefighters are reactive, and they act fast to shut down pain. That's when the managers fail, then the firefighters come in. They're more impulsive, and both use strategies like control, denial, distraction, intellectualizing. So the big picture, this is all takeaway from last week. The system is organized around protecting us from exile pain, and what looks like symptoms, so anxiety, depression, etc., are actually protective strategies. Okay, so we're kind of looking at symptoms in a little bit of a different way, which will be kind of really powerful for us to understand ourselves. Again, takeaway, managers are the frontline staff working day in and day out to keep the exiles contained. Firefighters are only called in when the exiles have overwhelmed the managers who can no longer contain them in the usual manner. Okay, let's now look at these parts in a little bit more of detail. So the managers, I call them milder managers, and the picture there is it's a prison, and it's kind of like a prison guard having a conversation with a prisoner, but they're having like a calm, friendly conversations. Prisoner is the exile, prison guard is the manager, the mild, pleasant manager. So the managers are protectors that are milder and typically well-behaved. They work on avoiding any situation which might trigger an exile with their pain, right? The trauma or attachment stuff from escaping and from us feeling that pain. So managers may present as part selves that are controlling. So you have an issue of control. That is likely a manager. Perfectionistic. How many people have that? That's likely a manager. That are perfectionist, overly intellectual, that's me, all right? Obsessive or self-critical, right? Or other critical as well. They can also be reclusive, passive, emotionally detached, phobic, or hyper alert. So all those are managers. And the thing about managers are present almost every day. So if you have these managers, they're around all the time with you. Okay? They're there all the time. As opposed to the firefighters, which only come out occasionally, but they're much more dramatic firefighters. So managers are why people who have experienced trauma might, on an everyday basis, as part of their personality, they might be perfectionistic, obsessive, they might be driven, or can't stand still. So this is another way obsessive compulsive disorder, can be seen as a symptom associated with a manager. Okay? So in biological psychiatry, we call it obsessive compulsive disorder, but in IFS, it's like, okay, what part does that belong to? Those obsessive compulsive symptoms. Okay, remember that the managers do what they do to keep the pain carried by exiles at bay. If we deliberately try to stop the managers from doing what their job is, for example, and this is like the problem with cognitive behavioral therapy, because it tries to deal with the symptoms, right? But from an IFS perspective, if you try to suppress the symptoms, you try to, get the managers not to do their job, what's going to happen? The pain is going to come through, right? So that's the problem. You can't get rid of the symptoms because there's something deeper. That's one of the problems with cognitive behavioral therapy. It tries to change the symptoms, but then what's underneath comes to the surface, right? And that's the difference between sort of more this psychodynamic approach, which says things are deep, as opposed to a cognitive behavioral approach that says, let's just deal with the surface stuff. All right, stopping managers' behaviors without understanding what we are doing may cause a lot of pain. So interesting, because just yesterday, I was talking to a lady, she's been my patient for a long, long time. And this lady has had back pain for a long time, all right? And she just had surgery. She had a laminectomy in her lower back, and the surgery was very successful, right? So she says, it's the first time in years I haven't had pain. But then she said, now I'm really depressed. What do I do? Okay, so if you look at it from an IFS perspective, you could see that, well, maybe the pain, right, was a manager, and surgery kind of takes away pain, but then you have the exile that comes through. That's the IFS perspective. I don't know. I was talking about that with her yesterday, and she kind of goes, yeah, that sort of makes sense. Okay. So, and then in contrast to the everyday, you live with them every day, the managers, they're part of your life. Then you have the fearless firefighters. And what I have there is that sometimes in prisons, they have a riot squad. There's a riot or if prisons are out of control. So that's what the firefighters are a little bit more like. They're more like the riot squad. They're not always there. They're only called out when they're really needed. So firefighters take over when the exiles have escaped the control of the managers and the pain of the exiles emerges into consciousness, right? So it's kind of a last-ditch approach a last-ditch effort to deal with the pain of the exiles. Unlike the milder managers, firefighters tend to be impulsive, reckless, and destructive. Their job is to extinguish or put out feelings, thoughts, body sensations, memories, images, and anything else associated with the trauma that the exile is carrying. Their job is to get rid of the pain, no matter what the cost. When they are done, they often leave a mess behind, right? So firefighters, they'll put out the fire, but, there's a lot of damage, right? A lot of water around, a lot of problems, right? And you have to kind of then call in a reconstruction company. I had a flood last year in my house, but no firefighters. So typical firefighter behavior, thoughts, and feelings include things like abusive drinking, drug use, addictive behaviors, eating disorders, self-harm, suicidal ideation, rage, violence, impulsivity, and dissociation. Those are all kind of, indications that there's a firefighter present. Firefighters can at times be reasonably well behaved. So they only come once in a while, but sometimes they're reasonably well behaved. They can be socially acceptable and resemble managers. For example, when they manifest as excessive reliance on TV, internet, computer games, right? Shopping, exercising, sleeping, or working. The problem is that even though they seem well behaved, over the long term, they cause a lot of damage. So, if you have young kids who play video games all the time, it's kind of like, it's a protector, it's a firefighter, might be reasonably well behaved, but, look at the damage it causes. Managers like perfectionistic parts or obsessive compulsive, they also cause damage, but, firefighters tend to cause more damage. And it's kind of, this is a little bit artificial. I think like the extremes, there's really well-behaved managers and really kind of badly behaved firefighters. But in between, it's kind of like, we're just making this stuff up a little bit. All right. So firefighters can also be poorly behaved and socially unacceptable when they manifest as addictions, affairs, rage, violence, abusive behavior, suicide, crime, stealing, self-injury, or eating disorders. The behavior of the firefighter is often harshly disapproved of by managers. So managers and firefighters don't really like each other a lot of the time. And the problem is that then not only are you dealing, because the managers and the firefighters are there to deal with the pain of the exiles, but just the conflicts between the two of them can generate more pain, right? That you have so many internal conflicts. All right. Now, the thing is, we talk about exiles, right, as the young parts, but there are protectors that can be themselves exiled. So it's almost like the prison guards that themselves become prisoners, right? So protectors can also be exiled, right? Meaning they can be system is trying to keep them out of awareness. So sometimes a protector becomes so extreme, for example, when people have rage, addictive issues, dissociation, or attack themselves, that the rest of the system, the other parts, turn against these parts, right? And they say, you're too much, you're causing problems, so that protector itself gets pushed away or suppressed. So exile protectors still believe they are protecting, often, and they feel misunderstood or blamed and can carry shame about their own strategies. Okay? So give you an example, a child grows up in an unpredictable, emotionally unsafe home. When attachment pain overwhelms this child, a firefighter part develops. Its strategy may be to binge eat, drink, self-harm, or erupt into rage. All these behaviors serve to shut down pain when the pain floods the system. These behaviors themselves cause the self system significant problems, which other parts fear and will try to suppress, disown, or shame. These firefighters don't disappear, they go into exile underground. Okay, I hope that makes sense to people. So mostly firefighters, they themselves can be exiled. Give you another example. So this example is a 42-year-old professional woman with complex trauma who presents as controlled, competent, and high functioning. So that's a perfectionistic part. That's a manager. That probably kind of is very helpful for that person, although there's always a price to pay. So this person hasn't binged in years, but after a very stressful situation, she suddenly feels flashes of rage, all right, and urges to drink. So firefighters, right? From an IFS perspective, a firefighter part once used anger and alcohol to shut down terror. That part was hated and banished into exile. So that firefighter, the drinking and stuff was exiled, right? It now emerges when the competent managers, so the perfectionistic parts and stuff, fail to handle the pain because of the stress this person had. So an ordinary firefighter says, let me handle this. In contrast, an exile firefighter says, not allowed to exist, but I still have to act when things get really bad. Right? An exile firefighter is a part that once saved us in extreme moments, but later got shamed and pushed away for the very strategies that it used to keep us alive. So this is why Alcoholics Anonymous says or maintains that once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic. I think they're recognizing that, abusive drinking doesn't disappear. It just goes underground. It becomes an exile, right? But it's there. And, the other exiles that alcoholics carry, they also don't disappear. They become exile, right? And this is like something that's recognized in AA. And, often people will say, oh, no, I haven't drank for like 30 years. I'm going to be okay. All right. It kind of flies in the face of what IFS says. All right. So takeaway: managers prevent pain on a day-to-day basis. So your managers are always with you for most of the time. Right? Whereas firefighters stop pain when it breaks through, and then you have exiled, mostly firefighters, but exiled protectors, while trying to protect us from pain, cause so much pain, they are exiled themselves by other parts. Yeah. All right, so I said, like in IFS, the rational manager is considered the manager, but it is different. So I kind of put it as a fourth part. So you have the exiles, the managers, the firefighters, and I think like rational managers and different part. We've had conversations about this too. It's kind of like, so IFS self, right? So we haven't talked about self yet, but we're going to talk about it in a minute. Is the seat within us of calm, compassion, and perspective. But in everyday life, most people are not in self, right? Most people, we're not like in self, we're not that calm and stuff, right? It's not self that leads the internal family. Most of us, if we're lucky, when we're in the window of tolerance and in DBT's rational mind, are being led by what we call mature adult, or DBT calls rational mind, right? So now that's what IFS refers to as the rational manager. Now, unlike most other protectors, the mature adult rational manager is not an emotional part. Most of the other protectors are emotional, right? So it's a rational, thoughtful, and it's goal-oriented. It's a part of us that understands consequences, makes plans, sets limits, and tries to keep life running smoothly. So I think I make a distinction. So IFS sees the rational managers apart because it exists at the same level as other parts. The rational manager can get into arguments with our emotional parts, be impatient with them, critical of them, or try to override them. Right? Self doesn't do that, but rational managers can get in conflict with other parts. Right? Unlike self, it doesn't automatically relate to other parts with curiosity or compassion. It relates to them with logic, persuasion, and control. Self, in contrast, right, has perspective on all the parts. It's on a different level. It sees the parts. The mature adult rational manager is in the system, negotiating and sometimes fighting with other parts. It's wise but not spacious, helpful but not healing by itself. right? In IFS work, we don't try to get rid of the mature adult. We don't try to get rid of any parts, but certainly not of the mature adult. We help it step back just enough so that self can come forward and so that the emotional parts can finally be understood rather than just managed, which is what the rational manager does, just manages them, right? And that's one of the differences between rational mind and self. Rational mind manages. Self understands and sees. And it's not just about managing, it's about understanding. All right, so takeaway, mature adult, DBT's rational mind and IFS rational manager are very similar concepts. All right, so let's talk about burdens. And I'm briefly going to talk about 6 burdens, talk about personal, legacy, cultural, burdens that belong to exiles, burdens that belong to protectors, and unattached burdens. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in the last 3, spend a little bit more time in the first 3 here. So what are burdens, right? So when you IFS, you're going to learn a lot of new language. Like, that's okay. It's pretty intuitive, though. So in IFS, burdens are the stored emotional wounds, painful beliefs, feelings, and memories carried by parts, especially by exiles. So it's essentially the burdens we carry. It's the skeletons in our closet, okay? The pain we carry. That's what burdens are. And they're things that actually happen to us. They're traumas, they're attachment issues, right? So burdens are usually caused by adverse past experiences or trauma, right? Burdens distort the natural roles and functioning of healthy parts, leading to internal conflicts and distress. So the thing with IFS is that it says that we all have parts, right? We all have an internal family, just like most of us have an external family, and some people don't have much of a family, but we have an external family. Like, we also have an internal family. And the difference between families is that there's some families that are securely attached, so they get along and they help each other, right? So if you're healthier psychologically, you still have parts, but your parts get along and they help each other, right? But if you have more psychological issues, the idea is that your parts, right, they're carrying stuff, right? And we know that if in a family, like, people have a lot of issues themselves, there's more of a tendency to be conflict between them, right? So because parts become burdened, right, through painful experiences and stuff, they tend to kind of have more conflicts with each other, right? So, parts, you want to exile them. You don't want to understand them, right? You want to exile them because they have too much pain, right? In a better functioning family, you kind of attend to the pain of your exiles, or they wouldn't be exiled, right? Because you kind of like want to understand. But in a more unhealthy internal family, you just can't deal with it. You don't have the resources to deal with it. The other parts don't have resources to deal with it. Okay. In people who experience emotional dysregulation, overwhelming emotions, and their accompanying thoughts and behaviors, their accompanying thoughts and behaviors are often manifestations of burdens. For example, shame, fear, abandonment, pain, flooding consciousness. So that points to a burden, right? Emotional dysregulation is the moment-to-moment experience of activated burdens carried by parts, right? And in IFS work, helping parts release those burdens reduces future dysregulation. So we're going to talk about healing, and healing in IFS is really about unburdening the parts so that, they don't have to carry this stuff, right? And we'll talk about that in a minute. So I said that there's 6 different types of burdens. There may be more, 6 that I'm aware of. And so they're personal burdens. These are burdens that originated in the individual's personal experience, such as trauma, loss, or difficult relationships. They often manifest as extreme beliefs or emotions like shame, guilt, or fear. So personal burdens, there's like an explanation in your life for these burdens. This happened to you, this experience, or you were brought up this way. So that was what burdened you. That was where your pain came from. But you also have, and these are very common, and they're a little bit more difficult to understand. We've talked about it a little bit in this course, but they're called legacy burdens, right? So these burdens are inherited from family or cultural backgrounds. They can be passed down through generations and might include beliefs or patterns related to identity, worth, or behavior that were relevant or necessary in previous generations, but may no longer serve the individual. They're not the result of an individual's direct experiences, but are inherited from family, culture, cultural or societal influences. For example, a legacy burden might be pervasive sense of shame or fear that has been transmitted through family stories, cultural narratives, or historical trauma. So, you often find, heard this many times, that I see a person and, they say, well, no, my mother is really kind. And, she wasn't mean. She didn't do anything really bad. And she was there for us, right? So I don't know why I'm so anxious, right? And then you realize that, the mother was anxious, right? And the mother, in terms of hierarchy, social hierarchy, she saw herself as being kind of the bottom of the hierarchy. That might have had to do with her own experience, right? But then the children see what the parents are doing, and they see kind of this, parent who puts herself, might be a people pleaser or a caretaker, and that's what they learn. So that's the legacy burden. It wasn't necessarily something directly that happened to them, but it was something that they inherited, they saw, and they assumed automatically. All right. Right. In IFS therapy, identifying and addressing legacy burdens can help individuals release these inherited influences and live more freely. Okay. I'm just going to get rid of the. Sorry. All right. If I can. Oh, go on. All right. So these are just some examples of the legacy burdens. And this is like, that's my example. So first generation Canadians whose parents immigrated from Southern Europe in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, which was like my family, as poorly educated economic refugees may feel inferior to people whose families have been here for many generations and may feel they need to work harder than others to succeed. So that's like definitely like a burden I carry, right? And I have sort of like a perfectionistic and, workaholic manager, but it's not too bad, right? So, and especially if you're aware of it, and this can be passed on from generation to generation. Okay? So I think my daughter also got this. Okay, and it doesn't matter like if you achieve or not, you still kind of feel it, right? So other examples, children of Holocaust survivors are much more likely to develop PTSD, right? And children born 6 months following 9/11 to mothers living in New York City have a much higher rate of anxiety disorders than the general population. So those, not something that happened in their lifetime, but they're inherited or legacy burdens. All right. And this links a little bit with epigenetics, which we talked about before, but because of time, I'm not going to go into it. And again, don't be overwhelmed by this stuff, right? This is just for your general interest. Just take away whatever you can. If it's too much, don't worry about it. So there are kind of ways of trying to map your legacy burdens, right? This is one way to identify and understand what your legacy burdens might be. You can try this. So go back to these slides. So do a family tree, right? For each person, your family tree, write down mental health issues, including substance use and trauma. Notice if there are patterns that repeat in various members of the family, not being assertive, being a people pleaser, overachiever, right? And then 3, ask if some vulnerability affecting your ancestors also affects you. So are you an overachiever like they were? Ask yourself, or anxious like they were? ask yourself what proportion of that vulnerability is just you, or what proportion comes from your family, right? And then ask the legacy burden if it'd be willing to let go of that burden, and if not, what is it afraid might happen if it lets go of that burden? All right, don't worry about that. I encourage you, we're going through this very quickly. Go back to the slides and read it at your own pace. So another type of burden, so we talked about personal and legacy burdens. This is the only other type of burden. I'm going to skip over the other ones, but the other type of burden that a lot of us carry are cultural burdens. Okay, so these burdens arise from societal norms, stereotypes, or cultural expectations. They can include pressures to conform to certain roles or behaviors based on gender, race, or socioeconomic status. And Western individuals, like most of us here, may, for example, carry cultural burdens of racism, consumerism, and extreme individuality. And we've talked a lot about that we carry this burden of extreme individuality, like we're all separate. I think that's a cultural burden that we carry, but we just we swim in it, so we don't really see it. So examples of cultural burdens. A woman grows up in a culture where emotional restraint is highly valued. So if you're British, for example, right? If you're a what do you call it? Stiff upper lip. Well, that's wasp. Like, yeah. So she repeatedly hears messages like, "Don't make a scene. Be strong. Keep your feelings to yourself." Over time, one of her manager parts takes on a cultural burden, showing emotion is weakness, right? This part works hard to suppress tears, stay composed, and avoid vulnerability. Meanwhile, an exile carries sadness, longing to be comforted, and a fear of being rejected if she shows her true feelings. That's an example of a cultural burden. All right. I'm not going to go into that. Exiles' burdens are burdens that are carried by exiles, right? So there's young parts. We also have protector burdens that are carried by protectors. I'm not going to go into that a lot. Now, I probably shouldn't go into this, but I'll just mention it because this is where IFS becomes spiritual. So if you have an allergy to spirituality, just like ignore what I'm going to say for the next few minutes. So, Schwartz, first, when he first started IFS, he didn't kind of talk too much about this, but in later years, he kind of felt, or he discovered that there are parts that he started to call unattached burdens, right? So these burdens are not tied to any specific part within the individual internal system. So they're not a part of you, all right? Instead, they're seen as external energies or influences. So this is becoming very much like a spirit, all right? That's where it gets in. So it's not part of you. It's not like, it's something outside. They're external energies or influences. It gets into like, the possession and exorcism kind of realm a little bit. Or influences that have attached themselves to the person, often as a result of traumatic or overwhelming experiences. Unattached burdens can manifest as intrusive thoughts, emotions, or sensations that don't seem to belong to any particular part. In IFS, the goal is to help the individual recognize and release these unattached burdens, allowing the internal system to function more harmoniously. And when you unburden this in IFS, it's a little bit like exorcism. I see you kind of thinking about this. You can jump in if you want to say anything about that.
There's a lot. Really common, like I haven't run into it in my practice using.
It's very uncommon, yeah.
Yeah.
And I just sort of like,
Yeah, I haven't run into it yet. And I think that's because it is very uncommon. And then also most parts, they may seem like this, at the outset, like they don't have a positive intent, but with enough self-energy, almost all parts have a positive intent, and
Yeah.
taking the time to figure that out is the most important thing.
Yeah, like when it's an unattached burden, I think we start off always assuming that it is like a personal burden or a legacy burden. And it's kind of, I think it's hard to distinguish, like to say, oh, this is, I think you have to be like really experienced to be able to say this is unattached. What's the name of the guy that writes a lot about it? He's one of the trainers. What's that?
Robert Faulkner?
Yeah, Robert Faulkner. So he has some videos on YouTube. Robert Faulkner. He talks a lot about unattached burdens. Faulkner, he's worked a lot with Schwartz, and he has one of the most traumatic histories in childhood. Right? He does a practice. So Schwartz has a lot of demonstrations how to use IFS with people. And so I've seen many of his demonstrations, but Faulkner does a practice with Schwartz, who Schwartz is a therapist and Faulkner is patient. Like, and if you get a chance to see it, it's like, it's gut wrenching. You saw it too, right? And it's like, it's crazy. It's so compelling. It's so real. Because Faulkner really kind of lays it all on the line. Like, at one point he's gonna, I hate you, to Schwartz, right? And they're close colleagues, right? But the parts really come through. It's amazing. It's one of the best practices I've ever seen, demonstrations. Okay, so anyways, don't want to dwell on that. Don't worry about it. It's just kind of a curiosity. So now let's talk a little bit about, because we explored the other parts. Now, capital S self is not a part. It's at a different level. So let's talk about self, right? So self is not a part. Self is who we really are, right? It's the witness or the observer within us. And Schwartz, he likes, what do you call this? Like when there are the 8 C's and 5 P's, what do you call that grammatically? What is that? There's a name for when you find something that has, anyways, it doesn't matter. So what's that? Alliteration, something like that, yeah. So he says, self is characterized by 8 C's, means it has these qualities. So self it has curiosity, compassion, courage, confidence, clarity, calm, connectedness, and creativity. And it also has not just 8 C's, it also has 5 P's. So it's really hard to remember this. And the 5 P's are presence, perspective, patience, playfulness, and persistence. I mean, if you put all those together, that's pretty good, right? That's like, wow. So anytime that we're not feeling these qualities in ourselves, okay, it means that we're not in self, we're in a part, right? Which means that most of us spend most of our lives in a part, not in self, not the real us, right? Now, most of us spend most of our time, probably a lot of time in rational manager, right? Rational mind, right? That's still not self. Right? Okay. So to some IFS therapists, and we've talked about this, including Dick Schwartz, the self is a spiritual concept that is similar to pure consciousness, universal mind, or how God sees the world through each one of us. Self exists on a different plane from the parts. It's like the sun on a stormy day. A disastrous storm can blow down trees and cause mudslides and destroy your house. That's our everyday life. We're caught up, if there's bad storm, that's where we live. We feel the effects of the storm, right? But when the clouds pass, the sun is still there, undirtied, undamaged, untouched. Self cannot be damaged or even dirtied. It's always there, even when life gets really stormy. And I really like that metaphor. And the metaphor is that, you know, the weather doesn't damage the sky. The sky is always there. The sun is always there. Weather doesn't damage. So weather is kind of like our lives. It comes and goes, it passes. One time it might be, you know, really nice weather. Like hopefully we're having more days like that. But then it'll be -20 the next day, and it'll snow, another storm will go, you know. That's the weather, right? And most of us identify with, and that's small s self. That's what we identify with. But I think what mystics identify with is they identify with capital S self, which is the sky or the sun, which isn't affected by the weather, right? And if you can live your life like that, right, you're living sort of a spiritual life. You know, you have a perspective. You're not affected by the everyday changes in the weather. You're kind of like, you know, it's you identify with the sky, not about you, right? All right. So a metaphor for capital S self, which we previously discussed, is the moon reflected in many buckets of water, right? We talked about this in the spirituality session. Each bucket of water is different, just as people are different, one from another, right? But the moon that's reflected in each bucket of water is only one, right? Each bucket only reflects the same moon. It appears that they're all different moons, but there's just one moon. It doesn't split itself into pieces. The same moon appears, albeit differently, right, in every bucket that reflects it. Now, some reflections, when you look at the moon in each of the buckets, some reflections might look brighter, others dimmer, or more distorted, depending on the bucket and the water in it. Okay? But it's still the same moon. The source of the light, the moon, is the same, comes from the same place. Right? In the same way, even though we feel separate, like we all feel separate from each other, and individual, right, and alone, the capital S self within us, like the moon, is the same in all of us. Okay, reflected in a different way, but it's the same. It is one. It is one seeing the world from many different perspectives. Right. I really like that idea that, you know, we're all kind of one, but just experiencing the world in very unique ways. Right. The buckets are bodies and individual minds. So that's what the buckets are. Our minds and individual minds, our bodies and individual minds, take many different forms, like we each do. The moon, the self, is a single awareness behind them all. To quote Alan Watts, you are the aperture through which the universe is looking at and exploring itself. Okay. So I'm going to go on looking at the time. Well, we're not doing badly. All right. Don't think I'm going to spend a lot of time on this either. Can you hold your question until, because we're recording, and so we'll take a break in about 10 minutes or so, and we'll ask questions at that point. Okay, thank you. Again, this is a little bit of curiosity, like the unattached parts. So don't worry about this, but this is something that Dick Schwartz talks about. So he talks about guides as a special kind of inner helpers or sources of wisdom that people sometimes encounter when doing inner work. Once you start getting to know your parts, the hurt parts, the protective parts, the angry or fearful ones, sometimes something new shows up. It's not really a part in the usual sense. It feels calm, kind, and wise, and Schwartz calls these guides. A guide can appear in many forms. A loving inner voice that offers reassurance, a sense of light, warmth, or presence, an image like an animal, ancestor, teacher, or a spiritual figure, or even just a deep knowing that seems to come from beyond your usual self. Guides are not something you have to believe in. They're simply experiences that many people naturally have once they open up inside. They seem to help the self, so capital S self, that inner center of calm, curiosity, and compassion, connect more deeply with something larger. Schwartz says that guides can come from within or beyond the individual mind. He doesn't insist that they're real beings or they're imaginary, but invites people to stay curious to them. But what matters most is that they help They bring healing, wisdom, and perspective. And a lot of people might feel things like, a guardian angel. Okay, so those can be guides, right? Sometimes the guide might help a part feel safe enough to let go of its burdens, or it might help you stay connected to self when the inner work gets difficult. You can think of it as an inner teacher, spirit, or intuition, whatever fits your worldview. The guide isn't there to take over, it's there to support your capital S self and your healing. All right. So what's the difference between guides and self? So IFS self is our core being, innate, always present, characterized by the 8 C's and 5 P's. It is us at our deepest level. In contrast, guides are inner figures or sense presences that offer help, wisdom, or support. They're not self. They are usually parts or symbolic archetypal representations. So self is the source of healing, guides, helpers that point towards or support self-led healing. Self is like the sun, guides are lanterns that help you find the sun. All right. So I'm going to skip over that. That's an exercise trying to kind of meet your guides. Encourage you to go back to the slides and take a look at that. Takeaway, 3 sentences from what we've been talking about, because now we've covered the 4 parts or 3 parts. We all have parts. Parts develop to protect us. Healing happens when self leads the system. Everything we discussed today and we'll explore in the coming weeks grows from 3 of these ideas. These are like the key ideas. DBT, which we talked about up until recently, helped us to manage emotional storms, right? IFS is going to help us understand the parts of us that create the storms. All right. So why don't we try to do this section and then take a break, and then we'll come back for questions after the break, okay? So let's just, because I already said, earlier when we were talking about parts, that parts interact with each other, right? And the interaction could be helpful. They can be kind to each other, but just like real families, they can have a lot of conflict with each other. So every family seems to have a baseline level of conflict. Some families are high on conflict, others low on conflict. Okay, not that doesn't vary, but there are families that are just more high conflict. Others there's lower conflict. Okay? That can change over time also. Like insecurely attached families, burdened internal family parts typically have unresolved conflicts that erupt repeatedly, producing high conflict internal families. Okay, so high conflict internal families are a little bit like insecurely attached families. There tends to be more conflict. During conflicts between internal family parts, conflicts between your parts, the person is often outside the window of emotional tolerance because your parts are fighting with each other. You're just kind of like experiencing those conflicts, right? Conflicts occur between managers and firefighters. That's like biggest source of conflicts, managers and firefighters. But they can also occur between managers and exiles, firefighters and exiles. Right? These conflicts can give rise to overwhelming anxiety, anger, despair, depression, confusion, and dissociation. And this is all in addition to the burdens you're already carrying. This is just the result of the conflicts between the parts. So it's a double whammy, right? The pain arising from the conflict between parts adds to the pain burden parts already carry. That's a lot of pain. And you see people like often criticizing themselves. Right? Wow, I'm so stupid. I hear that so often. Right? I'm so stupid. How could I have done that? That's like conflict between parts. It's like often, when you say I'm so stupid, that's often like a rational manager criticizing a protector. Right? So notice how the conflict between parts, which arose to deal with the pain of trauma itself, causes significant distress. This is like having a very conflicted family where each person is themselves very distressed, fighting inside their mind. So what do parts say to each other? What are typical things they say to each other? So typical things that managers say to firefighters. So managers are the better behaved, right? Firefighters are, the fearless firefighters include. So this is what managers saying to firefighters. Why don't you ever stop and think? That's like often the rational manager, because that's what it does, it thinks, right? You are totally out of control. You should be ashamed of yourself. You're hopeless. You're an idiot. Okay, some of the things parts say. So if you hear yourself saying that, okay, those are conversations between your parts. Okay, typical things that firefighters say back to managers are F off. I just felt like it. I deserve this. And try and make me. I don't give a damn and watch me. Because the firefighters aren't kind of as polite as the managers, right? So if you hear yourself, parts of you saying that, that's a firefighter. So the mature adult rational manager part often feels ashamed of the protector's behaviors. So we often feel ashamed of our behaviors. That's our rational manager. Oh, I'm so ashamed of having done this, right? So, and want to get rid of those protectors. People come and they say, how do I get rid of this? How do I get rid of those parts? So when we start talking about parts, one of the things people say is, how do I get rid of those parts? Right? Now that's the rational manager who is saying that. Right? Self would never say that. Self, but at that point, people don't have access to self. They're just managing the parts, right? And that's something we hear so often. So managers are often very critical of exiles. This criticism tends to mirror explicit or implicit criticisms the person heard or sensed as a child. So if your parents are very critical, it's almost like you absorb that voice. It becomes a critical internal presence, an internal critic. If you were criticized, you criticize yourself. That's a part. Okay. So this criticism tends to mirror explicit or implicit criticism the person heard or sensed as a child. These self-critical managers are known as internal critics. And I'm going to tell you, like in a little bit, to give you kind of the most common names of the parts. So go back and look at the common names. They developed. So why did these internal critics develop? So you say, why do I have an internal critic? And one idea is that they developed to preemptively protect the child or person by internally keeping them in line so that they would avoid external criticism from caregivers or partners. Okay, so if your parents are very critical, right, you develop an internal part that anticipates their criticism in order to avoid them having to say anything. But despite that, they still do it, right? But you do that to criticize yourself preemptively or anticipate so you don't get that ding from them all the time. Okay. Okay, you know what? I think let's pause the recording there. And let's take a 10-minute break. And I know okay, I think we still have 120 slides to go. Are you ready? All right. So let's talk about, because you brought up the question, how do you foster self and all that? Let's talk about healing in IFS, and we'll do this quickly because this is what we're going to do in the workbook, right? So don't worry, we're going fast. We're going to get into the really nitty-gritty. And this is why it's important for you to do the work. Because this is not going to help you if it's just a theoretical concept. It's going to help you when you start doing your work on this, right? So we've already explored how we all have access to self. Many of us can't see or feel self because we're focused on the stormy weather and cannot feel the calm sun and sky that is always there, no matter what the weather is. Right? So we talked a little bit about this before the break. Self is calm and quiet and may be difficult to appreciate because emotional parts, the weather can be so dramatic and noisy. It's hard, when there's a storm, it's easy to forget that the sky is still there, right? Self has the ability to see all the other parts within us non-judgmentally, if allowed by the parts to lead. It is a natural leader. The real self values all parts, believes that they all have good intentions, and want to play a positive role in the system. Real self leadership promotes healing and safe containment for parts. All right, let's skip over that. The self empathizes, appreciates, and wants to securely communicate with the managers, firefighters, and exiles, but unless these parts agree and begin to trust it, they will continue to do what they've always done. Self sees and understands the conflicts between the parts and wants to work on resolving them. Because they're the most receptive, they're the best behaved, self usually first works with the mild managers. You don't want to start with the firefighters or the exiles. Start with the parts that are best behaved. That's usually where the work starts. Addressing their fears, being patient, and being respectful of the pace they want to work at. So that's first parts you want to get to know is the managers. You know, the perfectionistic parts, the caregiving parts, things like that, obsessive parts. It then identifies and works with the dangerous firefighters, which may have previously been dealt with by using crisis plans. So crisis plans is a way of working with the firefighters, right? It can be helpful, but the work we did in DBT with the firefighters, right, which is the crisis plans, doesn't address what's deep underneath the firefighters. It's just a way of trying to manage. But as I said, it creates a risk, right? Because the pain can come through if you take the firefighters out of the equation. It only begins, so self only begins working with exiles when the managers grant their permission, right? Because the managers are the protectors. You don't want to kind of overlook the managers or the firefighters, the protectors, and start working with the exiles if you don't have permission, because they're kind of like often the children. You have to have permission of the parents before you start working with the children. When working with one part, self frequently checks in with other parts to make sure they're still okay. Healing happens when real self becomes a figure whom parts trust and feel safe with. Real self can then lead the system. And again, this is not like all or nothing. It's a gradual process. The focus in IFS is on developing and nurturing the relationships between real self and the various other parts of the system. All right? It's in a way, it's kind of like the children, when you have an internal family system that's not functioning well, it's like the children are running the show, right? And what you want is you want sort of this ideal parent, the self, to take over running the show. But it can't get rid of the children, right? It doesn't want to get rid of children. It has to earn their trust. So they trust. And then everybody's better off because the show isn't being run by these children who all have behavioral issues, right? It's being run by the self, who then takes care of the children, the parts, right? So IFS uses different techniques for engaging with parts. For example, IFS therapists often ask the person to ask a part what's afraid of, what it is afraid of would happen if it didn't do its job. That's a very most common technique. So if you didn't, if you didn't caregive so much, what are you afraid would happen, right? IFS also assigns homework asking the person to engage in imaginary encounters with their parts. So it's not just about doing therapy, you have to keep doing it afterwards. The goals of IFS. In IFS therapy, the goal is to help parts release burdens so that they can return to their natural healthy states. This process involves accessing the self, which can provide the compassion, clarity, and courage needed to facilitate healing and integration. IFS therapy involves finding a part to focus on. Very often, this is quite easy. Parts are right on the surface. For example, with someone who is full of rage or fear, therapists find the protectors involved, check with them, and get their permission to connect with vulnerable parts they are protecting. Therapists don't expect protectors to change their behavior right away. They just want their permission to go inside and help the exiles they've been protecting. If they don't grant it right away, if the protectors don't grant permission, self listens respectfully to their concerns until they feel comfortable relaxing back. Once parts have granted access to an exile, Therapists meet the exile and witness it completely, finding out whatever it wants them to know about how hard it was back when it took on the burdens. So this is like the trauma. You're meeting the trauma, you're processing the trauma. This is all trauma processing work. Therapists then help this exile come forward in time to a safe and comfortable place. After that, therapists help the exile let go of the extreme emotions, beliefs, and energies, the burdens it took on back then when the trauma occurred. Only then, when the exile is unburdened, safe, and free, do therapists ask the protector to consider changing its behavior. So you have to do the unburdening so the protectors don't feel compelled. Okay. The real healing in IFS takes place between the client's self and the client's part. It's not something therapists bring in from the outside. It's not to the therapist. It's like inside the person. Therapists are just facilitators. Therapists trust that each client has deep healing wisdom within themselves, and they respect that. In IFS, therapists ask some important questions. One is, how do you feel towards that part? Then they wait until they hear one of the C qualities. If there's no self there, therapists work with whatever parts are interfering with the connection until self is present. This process develops that inner self to part connection. This self to part relationship is the primary locus of healing. It stops a civil war and turns the client's inner system into a cooperating orchestra or team. Okay. So a lot of the healing is in what's called unburdening. So unburdening is a form of healing in IFS. So unburdening in IFS is the moment when a part is finally able to let go of what's been carrying that does not truly belong to it. To be unburdened, a part must be in a trusting relationship with self, which has witnessed and validated its original pain or memory. As this occurs, the part realizes that the system will be safe, even if it no longer is carrying that burden of having to do that, right? The system's going to be safe because self is there, right? It doesn't have to keep carrying that burden. The burden is then symbolically released, letting it go into light, water, fire, earth, whatever feels right to that part. After unburdening, the part remains, but it becomes lighter and often shifts to a healthy, preferred role at the same time. The self system becomes more flexible, regulated, and self-led. Unburdening does not get rid of parts, as the parts fear that they can get rid of. So that's why they resist. It frees them to be who they were meant to be. All right. So there's an algorithm for unburdening. I'm not going to go through that because of time, but it'll be on the website. Okay. And these are, so that's on the right is the book we're going to be using. We're going to go through. And that book is already in the 800 slides that you got. Okay, so the relevant sections are in there. So even if you don't have the book, I recommend you get the book. Even if you don't have the book, just work with the slides. The other book is You're the One You've Been Waiting For, which is, so the IFS workbook is more inner work, your own personal work. The You're the One You're Waiting For is a great book as well, but it's how you work in relationships, right? We're going to touch on it in session 30 and come back to it very briefly. But because, you know, we've been talking about how do you deal with relationships. So that's the link. There's a bunch of other manuals, IFS manuals. Okay. I know, like, this is one thing that I'm going to cut back on because this is therapist parts, which is something we talked about. And the cartoon there says, and this is the psychiatrist speaking, well, it's not my fault you fell asleep, nor is it my responsibility to wake you. This bill represents 5 hours of my time. Okay. So, so many people become therapists because they struggle with mental health issues and consciously or unconsciously are trying to understand and heal these issues. That's why mental health professionals, you know, they have a lot of issues. They often come from difficult families, right? Many therapists have perfectionistic, rescuer, caretaker, intellectualizing, internal and external critics, fawning, and people-pleasing parts. right? If therapists are not aware of their parts and are unable to stay in self when working with clients, because that's the goal, staying in self. All those 8 C's and 5 P's. That's the ideal therapist. You embody all of those, right? Their parts may become activated and negatively affect therapy if they become judgmental, right? That's clearly not self. When there's a problem in therapy, it's often because there are parts that are unrecognized, either and interfering with the process, either in the patient or in the therapist. These interfering parts may be mainly the therapists, the clients, or both interacting together. And if you're doing that, this is not therapy at all. This is just repeating, perpetuating the parts and perpetuating the trauma. Okay, when a therapist is in self, they are on the window of emotional tolerance and are patient, persistent, present, playful, and have perspective. Okay, so if you're doing therapy with a therapist, ask yourself, is my therapist these things, the 8 C's and 5 P's? Bring a checklist to therapy, check it off, give them feedback. The therapist staying in self when a client's parts are activated and helping the client become mindful of these parts is a critical element in helpful therapy. So we do get a lot of people that come in firefighter, right? Firefighter's dominant. And if you start to panic, you start to try to control your firefighter, with your rational manager, it's not going to work, right? Because there's going to be a conflict. So you have to stay in self, right? That's very calming for people when you're able to do that. So this is your question, accessing your capital S self. So how do you do that? And we're going to be talking a lot about this. So how do you foster self in yourself? So self doesn't become real by assertion. That's by saying, okay, I'm going to become self, but by enactment, by doing it, right? Every time you respond to a part with curiosity instead of judgment, you are strengthening self the way a muscle strengthens with use, right? So in this work, as you discover your parts, right? You don't want to be judgmental with your parts. You want to be understanding. You want to embody those 8 C's and 5 P's. And the more you do that, the more self gets stronger, like a muscle. The 8 C's, so this is an attitude towards yourself, towards your suffering, right? Because you might hate your anxiety and pain, just want to get rid of it. That's a judgmental attitude. We talked a lot about this in DBT. What we also talked about is try to understand them, right? And this gives you a deeper way of understanding. So IFS gives you a deeper way of understanding your suffering. So how do I understand myself? And if instead of judging yourself, which parts of you are going to do, but if you try to understand yourself, you're fostering self. I meant try to understand your small s self, you're fostering capital S self, right? So together, the 8 C's and 5 P's are cues that parts learn to recognize. Parts don't believe in self because of theory, they believe because of how self feels. They start to have a relationship. Many parts took on extreme roles because early on, no consistently safe, attuned, regulating presence was available through repeated self-to-part interactions, which you can do in your imagination. And we're going to talk a lot about this. Self begins to function as a secure base, safe haven, affect regulator, and a meaning maker. Parts are eventually able to give up their roles because of a better internal leader that resembles an ideal parent, reliably showing up and takes them on. So to give you a concrete example, because like this is theory. I'll give you a concrete example. There was a lady that I worked with, and when we're going to foster self, one of the things that I'm going to encourage you to do is to find an image. Okay. I call it kind of, how there's those dream catchers, right? So an image like that is kind of like a self catcher. it's a way, dream catchers, I don't really know, but my thought was always they kind of catch dreams, like good dreams for you. Okay, let's say it's that. But a self-catcher is a way of you catching the energy of self, right? And one of the things I think is really helpful is to have an image. And sometimes it could be somebody from your life that had a lot of those 8 C's and 5 P's. And if you had somebody in your life, like a grandmother, or, it could be an imaginary figure, it could be like a fictional character, it could be Jesus, it could be anybody. If you have somebody like that, right? And you start to picture it, you can even carry it in your pocket, a picture of that. Okay. And you spend time thinking of this and thinking of, oh, this person had all these qualities, and feeling it. And just kind of doing some mindfulness practices that capital S self, the energy is going to be embodied in that image. Okay? So I have a very clear image for myself of what my capital S self is. And it's, it's kind of like these 5 people that are behind me. It's 5 people because not one of the real people in my life, not one of them kind of totally embodied all the 8 C's and 5 P's, but each one of them had a significant part. So I kind of put them all together because when they're all together, they're kind of my guardian angels. When they're all together, they have all those 8 C's and 5 P's. Okay. And they do capture that energy for me. So if I'm trying to deal, work on a part, I call on them. Okay. And I imagine. And the more you imagine them, the more they become real for you. We're going to talk about that in a second. All right. So we're not inventing self. We are training access to a naturally organizing integrative capacity of the mind. Just as attention trains perception, relationships shape attachment, and practice shapes neural pathways. Relational attention trains and leads internally. I'm going to skip over this because of time. But let me talk about this. So this is what I was talking about at the beginning, because you're saying, how do you access self? Okay. So, I told you about this book by Tanya Luhrmann, How God Becomes Real, okay, or How Jesus Becomes Real. And I was saying, like, in this book, she went into an evangelical church, and as an anthropologist, she was kind of, how does God or Jesus become real for these people? Because when they first joined the church, they Jesus or God might not have been real for them. But what she says is that if you engage, you imagine it, you think about it, you see that image of God or Jesus or whatever as embodying understanding and being loving, right? And you spend a lot of time with that. The more you do that, the more real it becomes. That's her conclusion from this book, How God Became Real. Okay, but that's a psychological phenomenon. Because if we, imagine something like this, and we kind of think about it, it becomes more and more real. Let me give you an example. So, many of us, because in the West, a lot of people are atheists. They don't believe in God. So talking about this, so if you believe in God, like there's a spirituality there, right? If you don't believe, it doesn't have to be God. It could be like something else, higher power or whatever. But then you have more trouble with spirituality. But see, there's a slide. Let me go to this slide. Okay, this is a slide I want to go to. So we tend to think that things are either real, like a rock is real, or things are not real. Our imagination is not real. It's things that we're imagining. But the thing is, there's kind of a third category between real and not real. There's a third category. And the third category is ideas that exist between people. Let me make this, because I think it'll become clearer. So things like money the market, financial markets. Laws that we make up, all right? The concept of nations, right? They're examples of this third category, which are ideas that exist between people. Because money is not real. I mean, there are bills, right? But money is more than a bill. We attribute value to something. But money or laws, they're not something, they're like a rock. They're not real. They're things that become real because they're ideas that exist between people. And they become real because we agree on these stories, right? Now, so thing is, we're not even aware that these things aren't real, like nations. Nations are artificial. We draw boundaries between nations. Geography is, there's no nations. The whole world is just the whole world, right? That Americans are different from Canadians, it's a creation, right? But to us, things like that, like money and the markets and nations, they're so real, right? And the thing is that they have huge consequences because we believe these things, they have huge consequences, right? Now, what we decided, so at one point, for people who believe in God or spirituality, right? That concept is just like money or markets or nations. And just like those other ideas, money or market or nations, can have huge consequences, okay? The idea that, there's a God, but there's a self, can also have huge consequences. But it is an idea that we create. Now, the point, that Lerman makes is she's not saying that there isn't some reality behind this. She's saying there's, things like spirituality, like God and stuff. They are man-made concepts, right? But are they like the finger that points at something that is very difficult to describe? She says, I'm not going to say anything about that. It might be, right? But this is where, to answer your question, because how do you access self? You have to create it. It's kind of like the movie where, with Kevin Costner, Field of Dreams, where he was building like a baseball field, right? And, it's like, if you build it, they will come, right? So this is the same thing. The more you develop these concepts, right? And you don't have to believe that there's any spirituality or anything, but because like money, there's no spirituality, but it has such a powerful effect. And this is like a little bit, again, going back, I mentioned the tulpa-like process. That goes back to Buddhism. And the idea is that there are concepts that we start off creating ourselves, but because we develop them, we think about them, they become real, right? Through just our willing them into existence. So that's an ancient concept. Read about it if you like. There's more. So there's a little bit about that there. Just mindful. So that's how you foster. Is that, you kind of say, look, this is a thing. I want to marinate myself in it. Okay. A lot of spiritual traditions say this is real. If you're more of a philosophical materialist, Western philosophical materialist, doesn't believe in spirituality, that's still okay. You can still foster, because the tulpa-like process, creating it, becoming a presence for you, is a very psychological process. So is it psychological, and is there like a spiritual element to it? Maybe, but you don't have to have the spiritual element. You can just go with the psychological aspect, and it's still going to have a huge significance. So, because we've struggled with this a little bit. A couple of weeks ago in our Boyne group, one of the people was saying, well, I don't know if I'm going to be able to understand this because I'm not a spiritual person. Okay? And am I gonna really benefit from IFS? You don't have to be spiritual, because this is a psychological process. So if you leave all the spirituality aside, just thinking that, okay, these are concepts that we're imagining. These parts, something we're imagining, self, something we're imagining. It's not real. Even if you're just imagining it, it's going to be hugely helpful to your work. Doesn't have to be spiritual at all. Hope that makes sense. Okay, I'm going to fast forward. If you want to read more about what I've just talked about, go back to those slides there. I'm going to skip over the ideal parent figure as well. Just wanted to mention this. So one thing with identifying our parts is, when I work with people, there's parts that are very common. Hurt children, internal, external critics, caregivers, compulsive parts, perfectionistic parts. But then, like each person, there's parts that nobody else has, and they're unique, and you have to kind of discover. And you don't have your parts, you don't have to give these common names. You can find whatever name you want for your parts. So this is just a list of, this section talks a little bit about this. So the common exiles are abandoned child, worthless or ashamed child, scared child, lonely child. Okay, managers, common ones are the inner critic, perfectionist, the pleaser, the controller, the achiever, the caretaker. The common firefighters are an addictive part, a numbing part, an angry, explosive part, the avoider, escapist, self-harm part. It's not a complete list. Those are just some common parts, right? And, knowing these parts, kind of like you might, oh, yeah, that kind of fits for me as we keep doing this work. So how do we identify our internal family system parts? So we're going to be spending a lot of time doing exactly this in sessions 24 to 29 as we work through the IFS workbook. That's what the IFS workbook does, is help you to find your parts. Today, we're not going to spend much time on this material, but in the coming weeks, as we try to identify and get to know our parts, we'll be looking for trailheads, which are cues or clues or tracks that we can follow that will lead to our parts. So trailheads are like, anxiety. Oh, that's the beginning. Where is that going to lead me? And then you ask yourself a number of questions and you go, oh, that leads you to a part, but you have to know what questions to ask. In identifying our parts, we're not starting from scratch. All the holes you've already identified, be they diagnosis that we've had, obsessive compulsive, depression, anxiety, or psychological patterns such as attachment styles, anxious, avoidant, disorganized. They're all trailheads. Okay? They're always ways of beginning to understand your parts, given that you ask the right questions. So come back to this section, the following session, the following slides I'm going to present over the next few weeks as you're learning to identify your parts. Okay, so I'm not going to go over this because of time, but go back to it over the next few weeks. The key to identifying parts are trailheads. Let me just do this slide and I'll skip the other ones. In internal family systems, trailheads refer to signals or cues that indicate the presence of different parts within an individual's internal system. These trailheads can be thought of as starting points or clues that guide a person towards discovering their internal parts. Recognizing these parts is key to the IFS process. Trailheads help us find parts. Notice similarities between our trailheads and the holes we identified for our holes diary card. And parts are advanced holes diary cards targets. So common trailheads: strong emotion, repetitive or automatic behaviors, persistent or intrusive thoughts, physical sensations, intrusive images or memories. I'm gonna skip over that. So that's identifying internal family system parts. Gives you a way of doing that. Go back and read that. Okay. This is another list of common parts. So this list is offered in the spirit of lists of popular children's names. So parents that are about to have a child, often they go and buy books like common children's names, they go through it. This is the same thing. As with your child, you can name your parts, whatever you want, right? We suggest you let self choose the name, as other parts of you may want to give a part a name that is judgmental, like dickhead, you know, that's not a good name for a part, right? That's clearly like, you know, a rational manager that named that part, okay? So these are some of the common parts. These are, so again, this is the list of common parts. Indulger, procrastinator, wild child. I love wild child parts in people. They're like, they remind me of Thelma and Louise. Saw that movie? That's a wild part. All right. Okay. So there's a lot of trailheads that are already familiar to you. Okay. Avoidant attachment, physiological states like shutdown. And this is just to say that different languages, right? So a different model, so biological psychiatry, it talks about depression. But in IFS, depression is exiles carrying despair, protectors managing pain, right? So go back to these slides. So what to ask when identifying parts? So if you identify with a DSM diagnosis, states of activation or attachment styles, these questions may help you to find your parts. So if you start with a diagnosis like depression or anxiety, you can ask, what part of me feels this depression or anxiety? That's the beginning of your questioning process to find the part that goes with your depression or anxiety. Or if you identify with a state of activation, like fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, you can ask, what part of me goes into this state? Right? You're translating from one language to the other. If you identify with attachment, avoidant, anxious, or disorganized, what part of me learned this strategy? You're learning to translate. So these are, you're using these other models as trailheads. Okay, skip over that. Simple algorithm for finding your internal family parts. Don't have time to go into it, unfortunately. And then we're going to get back into this towards the end, because once you've identified, like you're just making their acquaintance. And the next thing you want to do is you want to really get to know them as well as possible. In the same way that, remember when we used the chain analysis, really getting to know our wholes. So this is like a really getting to know your parts. Same process as getting to know your wholes. All right. So go back and look at these slides. It provides a translation from a DSM diagnosis to parts, right? No time to go over that, unfortunately. So psychiatric diagnosis can be trailheads. And in this section, I go into what psychiatric diagnosis, what are the most common parts they kind of point to, right? So anxiety disorders, depressive disorders, association, what are the parts that suggest? So common protector parts in people with depressive symptoms and so on, right? And this is an algorithm for finding IFS parts based on psychiatric diagnosis. Okay, so I'm going to skip over all of that. This section, which I encourage you to go back to. So what do physical or mental health diagnosis and dominant states of activation have to do with IFS parts? I'm not going to cover that. Okay, I just want to go to the end here. So this is kind of a summary. When people begin IFS work, they often discover that their mind is much more complex than they expected. And that's the whole message of this whole course, right? As we talked about the unconscious and all this, that's the message we're giving, is that mind is much more complex than we thought, right? Parts that seem irrational begin to make sense. Over the next eight sessions, we're not trying to fix ourselves quickly. We're learning a new way to relate to our inner world with curiosity instead of judgment. Okay, so this is, I want to do this before we end. So this is an orientation to sessions 24 to 29. So this is what you need to know before to start to working on sessions 24 to 29, which we call IFS Workbook, Guided Artificial Intelligence Assisted Self-Therapy. You don't have to use artificial intelligence if you don't want. You know, when we did this, we used it, because it was quite helpful, and some people like it, other people don't. That's okay. So weeks 22 to 29, so today's 23, so 8 out of the 32 weeks, or a third of the simple course, are devoted to internal family systems. The backbone of this part of the course, will be working through the IFS workbook together. To get the full benefit, it's essential to engage with the workbook alongside our sessions, as the learning builds through direct experience, not just discussion. So if you just listen to this, you don't do the homework, you're going to get less out of it. I'm not saying, not trying to make you feel guilty. That's okay. You'll still learn some, but you'll get the most if you do the work. Up to this point, DBT skills and theory have been the main focus of the course. That work helped us to understand ourselves better and develop the ability to stay within our window of tolerance. That's what we've worked on, right? Now we move deeper and begin processing trauma using IFS, because it is a trauma processing approach, stage 2. This kind of work can be activating, which is why self-regulation is a requirement, not an optional skill before you start to do this work. The tools you've already learned are what make it possible to do this work safely and effectively. So here's a brief overview of what we're going to do in sessions 24 to 29. You've already seen that. Go back to that slide. So this is the format. Over the next 6 weeks, we're going to work through the Internal Family Systems workbook. The workbook is divided into 5 parts, right? And we'll spend 1 week on each part. The final week, we'll present the last simple tool, because so far we said there's 6 simple tools. We've done 5. The last simple tool is called Wise Mind Remediation. And Wise Mind Remediation incorporates internal family systems. And Wise Mind Remediation, when you get to this point, is the tool. If you're going to use any tool, it incorporates all the other tools. So you can just do Wise Mind Remediation and apply it to all your problems. Because it incorporates all the other tools. That's the last session. So each of the 5 parts of the workbook includes 3 kinds of material. So the workbook helps you to understand the concepts in the IFS model, a little bit like we've done already today. We did an overview. So it talks a little bit about theory as first part of the workbook. 2, the workbook has a lot of mindfulness exercises, right? But they're IFS mindfulness exercises. So in the coming sessions, I'm going to use the mindfulness exercises from the book, right? And 3, and this is the critical part, the workbook also gives you instructions of how to do the actual IFS work. It guides you through the IFS work, right? So for these, how to do the actual work sections, we're not just going to explain them. We're actually going to show you what they look like when they're used in real life. Right? So each of the 6 sessions is going to have 2 halves. In the first half, Kate and Stu, okay, are going to walk you through personal examples that Kate worked on ahead of time. So Kate worked through this whole workbook. We did it together over the summer. I worked through it. And Kate worked through it. And we met several times over the summer to prepare this work. And we put it all into the 800 slides. That's why there's like 800 slides, right? This is my work, there's Kate's work, and there's the IFS workbook in there. So these show you what the work looks like when someone is actually doing it. Because it's important to show you an example, not just kind of say, do this. We're going to show you this is how it's done. And obviously it's going to be different for Kate than for you, right? But it'll kind of like help you do your own work. So after each segment of this work, we'll pause briefly for questions or comments, because there's like sections, there's natural breaks, and we can't like do half an hour because we'll never get through any of this, but we'll just allow you to ask questions, because we're not going to record this stuff because it is like Kate's stuff. And it'll be a participant stuff. So we're not going to record it, right? We don't record those sections. But you'll have an opportunity to answer questions if it's not clear for you. Okay. Now that's the first half of the session, which is Kate and Stu. In the second half, after the break, I will be working with a volunteer, right? Using material that we prepared the previous week. This is much like, we had the practices, right? Each of the tools we did a practice, if you remember. So I'm gonna work with volunteers, but now instead of like the tools that we covered, the 5 tools, we're gonna do it for each of the 5 sections of the workbook. So today I'm meeting at 1:30, I'm meeting with someone. And next week, we're gonna start this work. First half, Kate is gonna do it with this too, right? Second half, I'm gonna do it with this person who volunteered, who I'm meeting with today. So what you'll have in the slides, this is what we're asking you to do. Now, here's how Kate did it. This is how I did it with this person. And then the slides prompt you, now your turn. So this week, you don't have to do any homework. But next week, you'll have the examples, and then we'll say, now your turn. And then you go and do those slides. Okay, I hope that's clear. So the goal is that by seeing the work twice, Kate and then me and the volunteer, and practicing it yourself, you begin to internalize the process. So every week you learn, you see it done twice, then you do it yourself. Okay, this is just a quick warning. If as you work through the IFS workbook, you notice a significant deterioration in your emotional state and are unable to use emotional regulation skills to regulate yourself, please stop the work immediately. I mean, we've made this clear throughout that if you're outside the window of tolerance, you shouldn't be doing the work. You have to stop, pendulate, go to a resource, calm yourself, get back to the window. So don't try to push through it. Okay, especially in this part. If necessary, use the crisis plans you prepared at the beginning of the simple course. Remember, this is stage 2 trauma work. And to do it, you need the skills and tools you've learned during stage 1 work of learning to better regulate your emotions. The Wise Mind remediation procedure is the 6th and last tool discussed in the simple course. It is a tool adapted to stage 2 work of remembrance, mourning, and processing. Okay. Stage 2 work, trauma work is often lengthy and cannot be done in one read and work through the material here outlined. For example, it's helpful to repeatedly return to the beginning sections of the workbook when trying to identify parts you have not previously explored. Once you've identified these parts, you will also need to explore them further. This will include considering the exiles they are protecting and engaging in conversations between these newly discovered parts and the self. Anyways, this is just a little bit of an overview. Okay, so this is the things working through the IFS workbook. Will help you to start working on all the steps outlined in the Wise Mind remediation procedure. I'm not going to cover that because of time. This is the outline of the IFS sections of the course. So there's 5. I just copied them and put them there. That's the headings of the workbook, the IFS workbook. Right. All right. All right. Let me just see. I'm going to skip over all of that. Just see if is there anything else No, I think that was it. Surprisingly, we still have 10 minutes left. I think I went really quickly through a lot of things. I threw a lot of material at you. Don't worry if you didn't get absolutely everything of this. This was an overview. I'm going to spend a lot of time on this. You'll have time to ask a lot of questions. Yeah, let's go to questions. Let's stop recording there. And we'll go to questions. I see Michelle has her hand raised.